Zulfi Bhutto of Pakistan. His Life and Times by Stanley Wolpert. Chapter 9. President Bhutto picks up the pieces. December 1971 to July 1972. Brave citizens of Lahore, President Bhutto shouted in Urdu on 19th March 1973 inside the newly renamed Gaddafi Stadium to an overflow crowd of raucous Punjabis. Many among them were angry People's Guards, led by tough Mian Iftikhar Ahmad Tari, a close friend of Governor Khar, who had fought the Pakistan People's Party workers led by Hanif Rame, who earlier had been put in charge of organizing the meeting. You must listen to your president quietly. Please restrain yourself and allow me to proceed. Lahore is my city. When I make an important announcement, I come here to seek your consent. Yahya's coterie had no vision. They were politically blind. They were bound to fail. As for power, I wanted power from the people, for the people. Power for the worker and the peasant and the students and intellectuals. Pakistan has a brave army. India must know that Pakistan has not been defeated. It is not Pakistan, but only a selfish, corrupt, and dishonest coterie that has been defeated. I had warned Yahya against war. Then I declared, we will run Pakistan, we will save it. In 3 months, we have managed to salvage it. We aim to do still more. 5,000 years of exploitation cannot be remedied in a day. In a year's time, inshallah, I shall be able to feed and clothe my people. By that time, Bhutto had either imprisoned or retired many of Pakistan's bureaucratic Brahmins, members of the wanted civil service of Pakistan, the highest echelons of the administrative framework that had held Pakistan together from its inception, managing most of the ministries and departments of state. People say that 2,000 government servants have been retired. Zulfi told his by now cheering audience in Lahore. But they were sucking the people's blood. They were parasites. There was a clamor for a purge. But when it took place, there had been complaints. We are in the midst of a revolution. We must root out corruption. Poor people will get justice. Mao Zedong said that sometimes the wind comes from the west, sometimes from the east. In Pakistan, the wind blows from all sides. In early March 1972, Zulfi sought to convince the leaders of the Northwest Frontier's dominant National Awami Party and Balochistan's Jamiatul Ulema ul Islami to participate in the National Assembly for just a few days' session in April to allow him to extend the state of martial law until 14th August. Bhutto was eager to negotiate a settlement over Bangladesh with India, but did not want to embark on such discussions until he could claim to speak as head of a democratically elected and representative government, not just as the appointed civil martial law successor to Yahya Khan. He managed to convince a skeptical Wali Khan, a secular socialist head of National Awami Party, of the cogency of his argument and the need for one last extension of martial law, even as he did Islamic fundamentalist Maulana Mufti Mahmud, the conservative head of Jamiat-e-Ulema Islami. Zulfi had appointed his strongest frontier supporter, Hayat Muhammad Khan Sherpao, as governor of the NWFTP, but to win over Wali Khan and Mufti Mahmud, had agreed to let them join forces in selecting new governors for the NWFP and Balochistan after the assembly met. Then, on the eve of convening the first brief session, he quoted the frontier's oldest and most conservative leader, Khan Abdul Qayyum Khan, who was soon to become his home minister, forming a frontier alliance between the Pakistan People's Party and Qayyum Khan's Muslim League. When the National Assembly was convened in Islamabad in mid-April, Bhutto had pledges from 101 members out of a total of 142 in his pocket. His election as president of the assembly was thereby assured. It proved easy for him to push through his party's interim constitution, reinforcing many of the martial law powers and special privileges he had enjoyed, more than Ayub Khan ever had. Astute politician and statesman that he was, Zulfi soon saw that he really had no more need of his martial law crutches, which only weakened him morally, for his idealistic young Pakistan People's Party followers, as well as all opposition leaders, kept asking, why? The legality of continuing martial law had been challenged in the courts, moreover, and was at this time pending before the Supreme Court of Pakistan. On the evening of 14th April, as the assembly met, a chorus of young voices kept shouting outside the handsome new Islamabad building, "Down with martial law! Bring back the rule of law!" Instead of ordering the arrest of the protesters, Bhutto ended his speech that night by dramatically announcing, much to the delight of the representatives, that martial law would be lifted on 21st April. This demonstrates my commitment to democracy and my infinite faith in the people. We are the harbingers of a new order, pulsating with pragmatic idealism and in tune with the symphony of the Third World. A week later, President Bhutto took his oath of office under the interim constitution at a lavish ceremony on the lawn of the President's house in Rawalpindi. I wish to assure the leaders of the various parties who have assembled here that, if need be, I shall travel from Karachi to Khyber to strengthen national unity and to bring about greater cooperation among us. To critics who had questioned the need for the pomp and show and extravagant spending, Zulfi responded, "This is a people's gathering. There is no greater strength than the people. It is the people's day, the poor man's day, the beginning of an era of democracy." Under the interim constitution, the provinces would enjoy responsible government led by chief ministers. The former governor of Sindh, Mumtaz Bhutto, was made its chief minister and Mir Rasool Khan Talpur was appointed governor. A figurehead now, unlike the president, who retained supreme powers to appoint or remove such office holders. There should be no political vendettas, Zulfi wrote Talpur in explaining the governor's obligations. You must never forget that the party belongs to the working classes, students and the downtrodden. Their interests come first. Try and improve their lot. Try and make them feel happier. Give them a sense of security. Corruption must be weeded out. Crime must be rooted out. Give particular attention to town planning, to health and cleanliness, to the inculcation of discipline, to the promotion of culture. The curse of Sindh is to be found in the worst form of reactionaryism. Do not give the slightest encouragement to reactionary forces. The President's house at Karachi has been transferred by me to the government of Sindh on certain specific conditions. I will not spell them out as these conditions are known to the present incumbent. However, please see to it that the wing reserved for the head of state is not used by anyone else. That should be kept clean and exclusively reserved. Zulfi and a lady friend often stayed overnight at the various governors' mansions, and he was keen to ensure that the presidential wings, at least in Karachi's and Lahore's government houses, were kept spotless and always discreetly ready for him to use without prior notice. A few days after writing Mr. Talpur, he penned a similar letter to Mumtaz in appointing him chief minister. You have Almighty Allah to thank for the great honor bestowed on you. The people expect much from you and you should not fail them. Concentrate on the problems of the poor. Remove the subhuman conditions. Give water to places where its blessings have not yet reached. Electrify the province. Make it a truly beautiful province. Sindh can be the California of Pakistan. Karachi was once the pride of undivided India. Now it has become dirty and ugly. Put clothes on her and make her a beauty. To begin with, why don't you toy with the idea of making the stretch from the airport to the intersection of Hotel Metropole into a model and modern European promenade? to impress all those who land on the soil of Pakistan. Zulfi hoped to transform Karachi into a powerhouse, into a pre-war Beirut or Monte Carlo. But the now abandoned concrete shell of the Casino Hotel, started shortly before his fall, is a grim warning to the future rulers of Pakistan of the danger of trying to erect a pleasure palace on the sands of the one-time capital of the land of the pure. Oriana Fallaci's interview with Indira Gandhi, who characterized Bhutto as not a very balanced man, had just been published in Rome. When Zulfi got wind of it, he immediately invited Fallaci to Pakistan. He spoke of Mujib in the subsequent widely read interview with History as mad. Reflecting on Yahya Khan, who was still under house arrest, Zulfi remarked, "What can you say of a leader who starts drinking as soon as he wakes up and doesn't stop until he goes to bed? He was really Jack the Ripper. The defeat we suffered is his. Yahya Khan and his gang of illiterate psychopaths." He called Indira Gandhi a mediocre woman with a mediocre intelligence, a diligent drudge, a woman devoid of initiative and imagination. But nonetheless, he was ready to meet her when and where she likes. That June, they met at what had been the summer capital of the British Raj and is now the capital of India's Himachal Pradesh, Simla. "We are going to India in circumstances which are but a part of a tragic legacy we inherited," President Bhutto informed his nation on the eve of his departure for Simla. "The war we have lost was not of my making. I had warned against it, but my warnings fell on deaf ears of a power-drunk junta. Some disgruntled men of yesterday have the temerity to question why we are going to India. Do they think that we should not seek the return of our prisoners? Do they suggest that we should allow the Indians to continue their occupation of 2 tehsils in Sindh and 1 in Punjab?" President Bhutto flew east from Lahore on 21st June 1972 with his entourage of 92 officials, journalists and friends, including his daughter Benazir. "Everyone will be looking for signs of how the meetings are progressing, so be extra careful," Zulfi cautioned Benazir on the plane that took them to Chandigarh. "You must not smile and give the impression that you are enjoying yourself, while our soldiers are still in Indian prisoner of war camps. You must not look grim either, which people can interpret as a sign of pessimism. Don't look sad and don't look happy." Prime Minister Gandhi was waiting at Simla's Eagle Perch airport as he stepped out of the Russian M8 helicopter that had lifted them there from Punjab's capital. Despite what they thought and had said to of each other, the two most powerful, popular South Asian leaders shook hands and managed to smile at this informal start of their summit. Pilo Modi and his wife Veena had driven to Simla Hill Station from Delhi the day. Soon after the Bhuttos reached Himachal Bhawan, the governor's house at which they stayed during the summit. The Modis were brought over and they chatted with Zulfi and Benazir for more than 2 hours, recalling old days. Pilo remembered. "The next morning, as no summit meeting was scheduled, I received a message to say that the president expected us at 11 o'clock and would like us to stay over for lunch, which did not finish till 3:30 p.m. Though Pilo recognized the pitfalls in Zulfi's complex personality, as he put it, knowing how much of a demagogue his friend had become in the past few years, he still loved and admired him enough to hope that the summit might bring peace to South Asia. Bhutto, let us make no mistake, is above all a realist, although he may play his cards like a poker player. A great bluffer when he holds a poor hand, but always ready to arrive at mutually acceptable solutions if his opponent is big enough or shrewd enough not to push him over into a corner." Pilo wrote of his oldest friend. People who judge him only by his demagoguery and his occasional intemperate utterances fail to take into account how often he has tempered his demands or watered down his terms. Pilo's formula for breaking the summit deadlock, which seemed to have set in by the fourth day, was to lock Indra and Zulfi up in a small room at Simla and throw the key away till the smoke came out of the chimney, as in papal elections. Pilo may have suggested that formula to Zulfi, for on the last day of the summit, the president hosted a dinner and as soon as it ended, left the table with Mrs. Gandhi. They went off alone into a small sitting room and their attendant teams went into the larger billiard room on one side and the reception room on the other. The two leaders would meet and then go back for further consultations and then meet again. Pilo recalled noticing once when the billiard room door was left ajar, Mrs. Gandhi leaning over the green table, scratching away, obviously at the draft treaty. Zulfi did not use the papal election signal but devised a code of his own with Benazir, who kept coming down from her upstairs bedroom to ask if anything had happened. If there is an agreement, we'll say a boy has been born. If there is no agreement, we'll say a girl has been born. The Radcliffe educated Benazir considered the equations chauvinistic, but shortly before 1 a.m., the affirmative mantra rang out in Urdu from the floor below. Ladka hai. It's a boy. The agreement signed at Simla on 2nd July 1972 stated that India and Pakistan had resolved to settle their differences by peaceful means through bilateral negotiations or by any other peaceful means mutually agreed upon between them. Within 30 days of ratification by both nations, Indian troops were to be withdrawn from the roughly 5,000 square miles of Pakistani desert soil they still occupied, and each nation agreed to respect the line of control in Kashmir, resulting from the ceasefire of 17th December 1971. Indira's final solution of Kashmir dispute appeared to be the permanent partition of that state along the new border, to be respected bilaterally. No mention was made of Kashmir plebiscite or of the 93,000 Pakistani prisoners of war. Some Pakistanis labeled the agreement as sellout worse than Tashkent, insisting that it included a secret agreement by Bhutto to end Pakistan's claim to Kashmir, which reflected the new reality of Pakistan's much diminished size and status in a South Asia dominated by India. The agreement had been arrived at with India can be accepted or rejected by the National Assembly of Pakistan, which represents you, Zulfi told the crowd of Pakistanis who welcomed him at Lahore airport on 3rd July. A people's government can never agree to a Tashkent. Even our worst enemy cannot claim that this agreement smells of another Tashkent. Zulfi insisted. I had promised you that there would be no secret agreement. Now you can see that there has been no secret agreement. I tell you as a Muslim and I swear an oath, I swear in the presence of the Almighty Allah, that there has been no secret agreement. On the vital question of Kashmir, we have made no compromise. We told them categorically that the people of Kashmir must exercise their right of self-determination. This was a question which could be decided only by the people of Kashmir. Neither Pakistan nor India had any say in this matter. What Bhutto had, in fact, agreed to at Simla was, to his mind, irrelevant as far as Kashmir was concerned. He had not accepted Indira Gandhi's position, no matter what was written on the piece of paper he may have signed. He was realist enough to understand how weak Pakistan was, how tiny, how lacking in power for the moment. He never doubted that Pakistan would rise again someday to reclaim Kashmir, as he always believed it would do. For Kashmir was a Muslim state, after all, and thus belonged by definition to Pakistan. No agreement could change that reality, which was firmly rooted in the labyrinth of Zulfi Bhutto's brain. He had enjoyed the week's holiday in Simla, taking along the largest entourage any diplomatic representative of South Asia ever took anywhere for an official meeting. And he had seen much of Benazir, eaten and drunk with pillow and breath and the bracing air British viceroys had once breathed. But he never for a moment meant to close off the Pakistani claim to Kashmir. He needed the agreement primarily to prove to the rest of the world, doubting London as well as skeptical Washington and Moscow, that Pakistan remained in the great game, that its president was a shrewd politician, diplomat, cut from the same cloth as Talleyrand. For a few were ready to believe that he was closer to Napoleon. Before my departure for Simla, I had told my task would not be an easy one. It was a very tough meeting, Zulfi told his audience at Lahore. They were negotiating from a position of strength because they had so many cards in their hands. But what did we have? Apart from principles, we had our people with us. In addition, I had the mercy and beneficence of the Almighty Allah with me. I talked to them firmly. Finally, they agreed and said that on the question of Kashmir, you may stick to your principles and we shall hold further discussions. Now, as for the questions of a no war pact, you have seen that there is no such thing. What has been said in the agreement is that we should avoid war. However, we shall continue our maximum efforts to uphold our righteous cause based on the principles of justice. It was in some ways easier for Zulfi to say and mean one thing to one party and its opposite elsewhere, for he was many Bhuttos. He could be a suave diplomat, a sophisticated realist ready to concede whatever was necessary in his dealings with Mrs. Gandhi and Swaran Singh, in the ratified atmosphere of Simla's viceregal palaces, signing his name to a formal document as the cameras rolled, agreeing that the basic issues and causes of conflict which have bedeviled the relations between the two countries for almost 25 years shall be resolved by peaceful means. Back at the Lahore airport, however, it was just as natural for Bhutto to swear and affirm by Almighty Allah that he had given away nothing, for he was among his people, and they understood that their Qaide Awam would never surrender Kashmir to a Hindu woman. They knew Zulfikar Ali Bhutto almost as well as he knew himself, at least in this regard when it came to matters of izzat of Pakistan's sacred soil, of divinely ordained justice. Only benighted Hindus could believe that any true Pakistani Muslim leader worth his salt would surrender Kashmir or agree to a permanent no war pact with them. The war would go on for 1,000 years, as it had for the past 1,000 and more, since the first troop of Arab cavalry, led by Muhammad ibn Qasim, galloped across Sindh and brought Kafir Hindus and Buddhists to their knees, offering them only Islam or death. Zulfi flew the next day to Rawalpindi airport, where another large crowd of admirers awaited him and listened to essentially the same message. Once again, the response was a rousing chorus of approval from the people, who viewed him not only as Pakistan's wise leader, but as its heroic savior. Though nothing was said in the Simla agreement about Pakistan's prisoners of war because India had refused to discuss them without Bangladesh at the conference table, and Pakistan had yet to recognize Bangladesh. Zulfi promised to negotiate further on the matter when next he met with Indira Gandhi and with Mujib. He had at least won the promise of full withdrawal from the portions of Sindh and Punjab still under Indian occupation and vowed now that inshallah we will succeed in finding a solution to the prisoners of war problem soon. We will remain friendly and peaceful towards those who do not commit aggression against us, do not occupy our territory, and do not hold our prisoners of war, Bhutto informed his cheering airport audience. 10 days later, he rose to address the National Assembly in Islamabad, ending its long debate over the Simla Agreement, during which he was accused, among other things, of having betrayed the people of Pakistan and every pledge he had made prior to his election. If we have betrayed every pledge that we have made, let the people of Pakistan determine it. Zulfi lashed back. I believe, sir, that we have unleashed a great revolution in Pakistan. I believe, sir, that we have opened the floodgates of a golden bridge. I believe, sir, that we have destroyed exploitation. He trenchantly attacked all his critics, those within as well as outside his party, but then diplomatically appealed to them to have some consideration. It is not the future of my personal position that is at stake. At stake is Pakistan, the whole subcontinent. The life and future and fortune of 700 million people is at stake. He felt especially hurt by the attacks from members of his own party. He asked them to discuss their grievances with him at some other place. This is not a venue for the people to have a kacheri. If in the National Assembly of Pakistan we are to take such an attitude, I tell you quite frankly, I tell all friends on both sides of the house that no individual can cope with the situation, then no person can save Pakistan. He was quite right, of course, yet how ironic for Zulfi Bhutto to voice that opinion in his highest of all elective assemblies in the country. From the first day I took over, I said that one person cannot make a country, but one person can destroy it. It is easy to destroy. Ayub Khan would have been surprised had he been there to find himself in total agreement with Zulfi Bhutto. Zulfi spoke for more than 3 hours that night because he felt compelled to answer virtually every disapproving word uttered in the 4 preceding days of the debate. He was acutely sensitive to criticism but also loved political debate, relishing rhetoric and the tricks of logic or sarcasm. Few of his opponents were his match. Do you think that Zulfikar Ali Bhutto of Larkana is responsible for the separation of East Pakistan? He challenged them that this individual, who was not even in politics of Pakistan till 1954, is the person who is finally, exclusively, and completely responsible for the separation of Pakistan. If you want that, well, I say, I can take this burden on myself. I did it. Yahya Khan did not. Ayub Khan did not. The policy of exploitation did not. 1,000 miles of separation did not. The fact that East Pakistan was in a majority and spoke a different language did not. It is all my fault. There was a responsive laughter, and few heads shook or protested his claim to the blame. So he quickly added, the crisis was in our stars. It was boiling. Nobody could stop it in 1971. It could have been stopped in 1950 over the language issue. I was nowhere on the scene. Let us face the truth. If you want to hang me by all means. But the fact remains that I am not responsible for the separation. Did he intuit then that he was destined to hang? Somehow he had an intuition that he didn't even have enough time, Husna recalled. He said, either I'll die or I'll be killed. He was obsessed with it. At times he used to say, I feel like giving up everything and going away. He was a man of intuition, but he always talked about death. In defending the Simla Agreement, Zulfi argued that there were only two other possible courses. The first was immediate war with India, the second to go under Indian tutelage for all time. Neither was possible under his leadership. My mandate is to build Pakistan. I will build Pakistan. It is for the future generations to decide whether they want to make it a progressive, prosperous and happy Pakistan. It is for them to decide if they will go to war or to peace. I cannot go to war, not in the next 5, 10 or 15 years. We have to release great energies and we have also to unleash a great force. I am not ashamed of what I have done to the people of Pakistan. I'm proud of having galvanized them. I'm proud that there is now a sense of dignity in the common man. I am proud that the Hari can tell his zamindar to go to hell and that he wants his rights. If there is chaos in the wake, it is the productive chaos, not negative chaos. There will be problems, but we can face them. We have let the giant sleep too long. What we have done is to set a great movement of great ideals into motion. I can mobilize the energies of the people of Pakistan and make them into a great, progressive, and modern state. Let the people of Pakistan then decide what is going to be their future with India.